Hi, so this little video presentation looks at chapter 4, which is the organisation and structure of buying and merchandising. And I'm really pleased to introduce my colleague, Heather Delaney, who is going to have a chat with myself about that topic. So perhaps, Heather, why don't you introduce yourself?
Okay, thanks, James. So, hi, I'm Heather Delaney. I'm currently the product management lecturer at Fashion Business School for London College of Fashion. I've been lecturing there for about 2 years now. Prior to that, I've worked in retail for about 14 years across the industry, variety of retailers, both in store and in head office mostly. I predominantly worked in children's wear, where I bought for luxury and also high street brands. Most recent role was working for Ralph Lauren outlet business, heading up the children's wear division for the European outlets. So delivered a multi-million growth for that business as it really took off the ground back when I worked there. And then prior to that, I was working for Mother Carers in a much more product development role. Again, working across multi-product and categories on the department. So yeah, that's my background.
So a lot of experience. And what I think is really interesting is you mentioned outlet stores,
Yes.
which are off price.
Off price, yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that sort of strikes me as being quite an interesting segue into the contribution you made to chapter 4, looking at buying and merchandising structures.
Yeah.
There's no single one way of organizing a business and the buying and merchandising function. So sort of in quite general terms, who would you say are the key characters or the key roles that are involved at an operational day-to-day level within the product management process?
So primarily the buying and merchandising team. So, and again, like you said about structure, there's no set structure. It really varied and it even changed whilst I was there as each department grew, needed more headcount, and the structure would change. So, within a merchandising team, you'd have your you might have a senior merchandiser heading up the department, or just a merchandiser, juniors below them, assistant merchandisers, and then whether you'd have allocators or merchandisers assistant. Again, it varies by different companies. They might have a separate distribution function that took that allocation role away from the merchandising teams in some businesses that I've worked for. So,
yes.
And equally on the buying side, a similar sort of structure, but with the buyers and assistant buyers, junior buyers.
Absolutely. And then I would guess on a day-to-day basis, sort of without sort of going into too much detail about all of the roles, but I would guess each level, whether it's senior merchandiser, junior merchandiser, assistant merchandiser, allocator, distribution assistant, merchandising assistant, whatever title they have, they would then have their own internal connections as well. So I'm thinking perhaps the allocator, for example, may have a very strong relationship with the warehouse or a distribution centre in terms of allocation planning and the flow of stock in and out of the business.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, so they would be, daily communication to them, planning in. They'll be working to their own calendar and the peaks and troughs of the DC, as well as if the DC is being used by other retailers as well. There's that to consider, and different things affect the flow of the stock in. And they do have quite a strong connection with the supply base as well, and managing those deliveries into the DC and planning their stock levels. Sort of dealing with the sort of daily nitty gritty and presenting that data in terms of like critical path, then back to the sort of higher levels of the assistant merchandisers.
Absolutely. And then that also then sort of leads me then to think, you talked about the supplier relationship as well, is that the relationships are not all internal, there are external relationships as well. And in many ways, the management of that holistic set of relationships is probably quite a key element within all roles within buying and merchandising. Even at the entry level point, you're not working in isolation. You are developing a very good rounded knowledge of how a business or how a fashion retail business operates.
Yeah, definitely. And I know from my experience that at every role, no matter how junior it was, you had a counterpart, whether that was in buying or merchandising or the DC or a supplier. There'd be someone at your level that you would communicate with, which would then develop as you moved up the ladder. But I think it's really important that you get that grounding and that build that relationship off from the offset, and how to communicate with each other and work together, you know, because you've ultimately got the end goal, shared goal of getting your stock into your business or getting in and back out again into the stores. So I think it's really important that it's embedded from the offset.
Absolutely. And as part of that, therefore, is the embedding of stock management. And I think that again is a key word.
Yes.
You said, is that ultimately everything on the merchandising side really pivots around the management of stock. One, to drive margin in terms of profitability, to drive stock turn in terms of efficiency of that stock management, and three, to enhance or develop or protect cash flow for the organization. So what about strategically then, sort of leaving all the day-to-day side apart, how would a buyer and merchandiser or B&M team, who would they work with, and how would they develop longer term plans, say for a season ahead or for a season, two seasons ahead?
Yeah, I guess they're there to deliver the business strategy that the higher directors have set. So, you know, it's about knowing their business inside and out, but also their customer, and actually sort of how can they deliver that strategy, because they know their business so well and what the customer wants, how they can deliver those KPIs. So they would work with their suppliers on, you know, sharing that vision, sharing that strategy, because, you know, these are quite often long-standing relationships, and, you know, they kind of in a way need each other. Suppliers need the business to help grow their business as well. So again, sharing that strategy would help them too, in terms of delivering that strategic contribution, sort of down to the nitty gritty. There'll be forecasting sales and managing that flow of stock into the company, like you said, about stock turn and cash flow, and keeping it, you know, bringing it in at the most profitable time. And I guess that's where it goes back to knowing their business and, you know, knowing what works at the right time.
Absolutely. That's very interesting, because that leads me on to a further thought that's popped into my mind. I mean, you talked about the right time to bring stock into the business. So in terms of the planning, the strategic planning for a season, which is done in advance of the season beginning, because you can't have a season without a plan. So you have to do that prior to the season beginning. And then the activities within season, when you have to trade your plan and make it as efficient and as successful as you possibly can. That must logically mean that the role splits another way, rather than just hierarchical job roles. It also splits between a forecast planning approach and a day-to-day trading reactive approach. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, so I mean, you obviously got your history and your planning. You can look at what happened last year, you can look at double last year, and you'll have an understanding of a bit of a pattern. But again, you know, things like the pandemic can throw a complete U-turn and a spanner in the works. And I think it's about, you know, being really, obviously knowing your business in terms of the history, but then also being forward thinking and just being quite, using your initiative quite a lot, and just, you know, picking up early signs of things that might have a further impact within your business. So you obviously got to, it's quite a juggling act in terms of like managing the day to day, but then also thinking what's happening for your next month in terms of like Wizzy, but then also what are we going to be doing this time next year? So, you know, what impact, for example, has the pandemic going to have on how the customer's going to be shopping next year? It's going to be really, you know, I'd imagine it's very difficult out there for the buying and planning teams. So it's a real balance between the two, forecasting and also the here and now and planning on what you're doing. So yeah, a real juggling act.
Absolutely. And again, with pandemic, we are conducting this discussion on Zoom.
Yeah.
We're not able to meet because we are in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And you're right. I mean, there are things that happen that we can't control, and as buyers and merchandisers, we have to be able to manage those. And of course, it doesn't just have to be a environmental shock; it can be a technological shock. And certainly with ecom and the development through the internet of ecom, mcom, or e-commerce and mobile commerce, we now have multiple distribution channels around which buyers and merchandisers have to plan their ranges. So
Yeah.
how has ecom further added complexity to the buying and merchandising process?
I guess it's made such a probably several layers of complexity in there. I mean, with the traditional buying calendar, as we know, it's gone out the window and it's completely changed with, you've got ever demanding customers, shopping all hours of the day, and, seasonless ranges are almost required. People can travel the world as well, don't just ski swimwear in the summer and all of that. But yeah, I think it's required the businesses to be more sophisticated and agile in their approach to support these changes, and even more analytical. It's all about analysis, and it's, even as a buyer, yes, it's a more creative role, but you cannot do that role without having an analytical mindset, understanding the numbers, because it just goes hand in hand, and you can't just go with a range because you got a gut feel for it. You've got to back up that decision making because it's so competitive out there. So I think multi-channel has really impacted the layers of analysis and probably created new roles in terms of like data analytics, and you obviously got the technical side in terms of AI that can do stuff for you, but it's actually interpreting that data and what does it mean, and what are the customers doing, why are they shopping at 2 a.m. and who are they, and also things like customer experience roles in terms of offering that support online when you are shopping, is about those people knowing the product. So if you're asking questions, having that product knowledge, so then that can actually maybe turn that inquisition into an actual sale. So, supporting the customer in that sense. And then also in terms of actually presenting the product, it's not just about VM guidelines in store. It's how does it look in terms of on the page? Everyone's computers, phones, they're all different in terms of how things look. So that's probably created in terms of new roles in sense of photography and the presentation, and you want to be really sure when you buy that product that it's going to be the right one for you. And I think ASOS do fits on different size models, so you can see different, how it's going to actually fit to your body shape, or it can, the opportunities are kind of endless in terms of that sort of thing.
I'm sitting here just listening to you saying all of that, and I'm getting sort of anxiety knots in my stomach, because if you think about it, the product management process and the concept to carry a bag process is actually quite procedural. You start at the beginning, and then you do this, and then you do that. It's very much history based. You start with understanding what your history was. In terms of futurizing, and then in addition to that, you then have the very hierarchical planning and trading process, whether it's through the range review process, which can be carried out over 3 or 4 meetings. Once you're in season, the monthly or weekly trading meetings where you're reviewing forecasts to the end of the season. It all sounds very well structured, very well organized, but actually, because of the granularization, I guess, of the ability of the consumer to buy what they want, when they want, how they want, where they want, the element of control is slipping away from buying and merchandising and the retailer, and it's sitting more and more in the hands of the consumer. Do you foresee a period in time that may be quite soon, within 2, 3, 4, 5 years, where the prevailing structures of how you create ranges changes, and we sort of move away from history and we just go with ideas, because we can't control what the consumer's going to do. We can at our best present them with ranges that they're going to like, but they've got so much choice, and we know consumers aren't loyal to brands in the way that they were in the past. Is there any point having the structures and organizational activities when we can no longer control it in the way that we did?
Yeah, I think that's interesting, like, because, you know, with the amount of CVAs and the high street falling down at the moment, you know, I don't think that way of working is working very well at the moment, and something has to change. You know, I don't know what the answer would be, but the customer is very demanding. They want like exclusivity, so maybe it is about giving them more control and, you know, making them think that they are the ones designing this collection. But, you know, it's just giving them the options in terms of the customization, like these are your options in terms of the product, how would you like it presented? But at the same time, you know, the brand still has the control in terms of like volume, and is it more about continuity lines from the getting product ready made, you know, in just, so say for example t-shirts, just blocks of loads of white t-shirts, and then the customer can then just choose exactly what they want on that. You know, this is very simplistic, but, you know, is that the way the customer's going, and they feel like they're in control because they're, oh look, I don't design this and it's one off and one of a kind. But how it will work for a full range, I don't know the exact answer. It's something to think about. But that would also help in terms of like sustainability and not overproducing too much, that, you know, many fashion retailers do, even the ones that aren't fast fashion. There's always an element of terminal stocks at the end of the season, and it's sitting in store, swinging around, and, you know, no one wants to buy it. So it's about how can we make that more efficient, and, you know, maybe give the customer what they want, because that's what they're demanding, you know, the limited edition and that sort of, those drops, it makes it more exclusive, or collaborations. So yeah, it's interesting. I think something needs to change, definitely.
Which actually spookily brings us back to stock management. Yeah, I mean, you're talking about terminal stock, you're thinking about things still being in store or available online when people don't want to buy it because you've misjudged volume or you've misjudged timing. Which there, and you've also talked about customization, or from mass customization into individual customization of product. Which then leads me to my final question. We've always thought of buying and merchandising as being equals. We talk about buying and merchandising, not buying with a bit of merchandising, or merchandising with a bit of buying. They're sort of seen as being a unified whole. If the consumer is going to start being more actively involved in design or the creation of bespoke ranges, does that reduce the buyer role into something that's more visionary and narrower, but more strategic, and allows the merchant, and in turn facilitates the merchandiser role to become broader and more multi-skilled as they take on perhaps some more of the traditional buyer roles, because ultimately they'll be controlling a perpetual inventory, one that's constantly evolving and changing, rather than one that's being created and delivered.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think maybe the buyer role, it needs to, like say, be visionary and give, if the customers are demanding more and more excitement, and, you know, they're almost think like the trickle up theory, it's coming from the street. This social media, you know, are really customers influenced by the catwalks that, you know, traditionally the buying world was, you know, based off. You know, is it more about streetwear? We know there's a lot of collaborations that are, you know, that seems to be the way forward for many brands. So is it about being much more visionary and trying to come up with the next best thing, or is there a way of working with the buyer and the customer together to kind of deliver that? I don't know. Like, it's interesting how it might be in the future. But you know, I think it's maybe going back a bit, being even more creative, because I think the buying role has got very analytical, which is very, very important, and it's required, but maybe trying to add in some more creativity to add that excitement, and, you know, what kind of goes back to the roots of a buyer and stuff. So yeah, who knows?
So therefore, putting all
Yes.
this together,
Yeah.
within chapter 4, we have presented different structure charts for buying and merchandising teams. We've also talked about key contacts and relationships and how they work. We've also done that in the context of the value chain and how there's a sequential process to create value. But perhaps we need to keep an eye on the ground, and perhaps the evolution that you've said, no two businesses run their B&M in exactly the same way. I wonder whether there's going to be more mutation in the not too distant future, and we just need to keep an eye on that.
Yeah, definitely. It will be unique to each business, and I don't think there is no, you know, one-stop structure that's going to work for everyone. It's going to be very unique to the business, to the customer,
Yes.
and, you know, where they vision their future. So
Yes,
interesting.
absolutely. Okay, thank you very much. I think that's been a very interesting conversation, and good luck for the next academic year.
Thank you, James. You too.